What would you do if you found a foreigner and his child, barefoot, on a lonely Japanese road? It was a question Aya Takahashi never imagined she would have to answer. The mountains had already swallowed the sun, and a thin mist hung over the narrow road that wound through her village. She walked quickly, her canvas shopping bag digging into her shoulder, the faint smell of soy sauce and daikon clinging to her sweater. Ahead, the rice fields lay dark and still, cut only by the occasional flicker of a firefly. That's when she heard it. Soft at first, like the whimper of a kitten. Then again, higher, sharper, unmistakably human. Aya froze. Turning slowly toward the sound, she saw them. Under the crooked branches of a persimmon tree stood a man and a boy. The man sat on his heels, leaning against the tree trunk as if he'd been there for hours. His suit, if it could still be called that, was wrinkled, his white shirt smeared with dust and sweat. His shoes were gone. Next to him, a boy no older than 6 clutched a worn-out doll to his chest. Even in the dim light, Aya could see their hands, the boy's small and trembling, the man's large but still, resting limply on his knees. Her first instinct was to keep walking. Foreigners were rare in this part of Gifu, and she'd learned enough from the news to know that trusting strangers, especially those who didn't belong here, could be dangerous. She took another step forward anyway. The man lifted his head slowly, and their eyes met. His face was gaunt, his beard days overdue for a shave, his expression unreadable, but it wasn't fearsome. If anything, it was exhausted. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, but the Japanese was careful, deliberate. Just, water, please, and somewhere to stay. Only tonight. Aya's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. It wasn't just the words. It was the boy. The way his gaze clung to her, wide and hollow at the same time, as though he had already lost too much to hope for kindness. Her feet refused to move away.
"Come," she said at last, her own voice surprising her. "My house is small, but there's space for those who need it." The man's shoulder sank slightly, not quite relief, but something close, and he rose, gathering the boy into his arms. They followed her in silence down the gravel path to her home at the edge of the village. Her house was modest, weathered wooden walls, paper shoji doors patched with tape, the faint scent of tatami and old coffee clinging to the air. She lit a single bulb in the kitchen and set a pot of rice to cook, motioning them to sit at the low table. They obeyed without a word. As the rice steamed and the rain outside began to patter more insistently, Aya risked glances at them. The boy, Ethan, she would later learn, kept his tiny hands around his doll, never letting go. His feet swung above the tatami, his head drooping with fatigue. The man, Daniel, sat rigid, his eyes fixed on the knot of the tablecloth as though it held the answers to questions she couldn't even guess. When she finally placed bowls of rice and miso soup before them, he murmured thanks but barely ate. Ethan finished quickly and fell asleep on the tatami, the doll pressed to his cheek. Daniel stayed awake, even after she showed them to the small guest room. Long after she retreated to her own futon, she could hear him moving, soft steps on the creaking floorboards, the faint sound of him opening and closing the sliding door to the garden. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any lie, and as Aya lay there, staring at the ceiling, she wondered if she'd just let something dangerous into her home, or something broken enough to deserve her mercy.
Sometimes silence speaks louder than any lie. The first night in Aya's home was heavy, with a silence that clung to the walls, stretching between them like an invisible thread. After dinner, she showed them to the small guest room, little more than a storage space she had hastily cleared that evening. The futon was thin. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, and the single window overlooked the quiet garden where moonlight pooled on the stones. "It's not much," she said softly, sliding the door open. Daniel nodded, offering a muted, "Thank you." Ethan stumbled inside without a word, the doll still gripped tightly in his hands. He dropped to his knees and curled up on the futon, as if his body had been waiting all day for permission to collapse. Within minutes, his breath evened out, and he was asleep. Aya lingered at the doorway, unsure if she should say more. Daniel stood at the edge of the room, not moving to sit. His eyes lingered on his son, then flicked to the floor, then to her, but only for a heartbeat before dropping back down. "If you need anything, we're fine," he interrupted quietly, almost apologetically. She swallowed whatever words she had meant to offer and slid the door shut, leaving them to their strange silence. In her own room, Aya sat cross-legged on the futon, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling beams above her. She could hear the faint drip of water outside, the chorus of frogs from the rice paddies, and, faintly, the shuffle of his feet beyond the paper-thin wall. Sleep didn't come easily. Sometime later, maybe minutes, maybe an hour, she heard the shoji door to the garden slide open. Curiosity tugged at her. She got up quietly, pulling her sweater tighter, and peeked into the hallway.
Through the open door she saw him, a dark silhouette against the pale garden stones. Daniel was sitting on the edge of the engawa, elbows on his knees, head bowed. The boy lay undisturbed inside, but the father. From where she stood, she couldn't see his face, but something about the curve of his back and the way his hands hung limply between his knees struck her as unbearably lonely. He didn't belong here, that much was clear. Not just because of his foreign features or his clumsy Japanese. There was something else, something heavier that he carried like an unspoken confession. For a moment, she considered stepping closer, asking if he was okay, but she didn't. Instead, she retreated quietly to her room, letting the door click shut. The next morning came gray and damp. Aya woke to the faint sound of dishes clinking. When she stepped into the kitchen, Daniel was already there, standing awkwardly by the sink, his sleeves rolled up. "You don't have to," she said, startled. "It's the least I can do," he replied without looking at her, scrubbing one of the bowls from last night. The boy sat at the table, sleep still in his eyes, gently tapping the doll's feet on the wood. Aya poured tea for herself and watched them from the corner of her eye. Daniel moved like a man who had done this before. Not quite a guest, not quite a host, caught somewhere in between. They didn't speak much over breakfast. The boy ate quietly. Daniel answered her polite questions with short, careful words. But when she caught him glancing at her, once, briefly, there was something in his eyes that unsettled her. Not fear, not arrogance, gratitude, and something else she couldn't name yet. What starts as one night can stretch into forever. Daniel had promised would be just one night, slowly bled into days, and then a week. Aya didn't ask him to leave, not directly, and Daniel didn't make any move to go, not yet. In the quiet rhythm of her home, they all found themselves drawn into something they hadn't planned. On the second morning, she returned from the market to find the small garden swept and the futon neatly folded. Ethan was sitting on the engawa steps, legs dangling, his doll tucked under one arm, while Daniel was crouched near the soji door with a small toolbox at his feet. The door, which had groaned and stuck for months,
now slid open, as smooth as water.
"I thought it could use fixing," he said, almost sheepishly, still avoiding her gaze.
Aya blinked at him, taken aback by how precise his work was. The edges of the frame aligned perfectly, the wood freshly sanded and even oiled.
"You've done this before?" she asked carefully.
For a fleeting second, something in his eyes sparked. Recognition, or maybe regret.
"A little," he murmured. "Long ago."
Days passed, and the house began to feel oddly fuller. Ethan followed her around, mimicking her movements as she watered the plants and folded laundry. He giggled at the squeaky kettle, clapped when the rice cooker popped, and looked at her like she held all the answers to a world he'd barely begun to understand. "Oh, Basan," he called her, once. "Auntie." It stopped her in her tracks. She hadn't heard that word directed at her since she was a child herself, when her cousins still visited before life scattered everyone like sakura petals in the wind. Daniel froze when he heard it too, sitting on the porch with his elbows on his knees. His expression didn't change, but she noticed the way his fingers tightened briefly, then relaxed again. One evening, Aya came home from the workshop to find Daniel repairing the old wooden gate at the edge of her property. It was strange to see him like that. Sleeves rolled, hair falling into his face, hands steady as he measured and hammered. Not just strange, unsettling. The movements weren't clumsy or hesitant. They were deliberate, confident. He handled the tools like someone who had spent a lifetime working with his hands, not like someone who had stumbled into a village by chance, barefoot and broken. "You're good at this," she ventured, standing at the gate with her arms folded. Daniel paused, his hammer midair, and let out a breath. "Some things stay with you," he said simply. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, Aya found herself sitting at the kitchen table long after the dishes were cleared, staring at her hands. This man, this foreigner, who arrived with nothing but exhaustion and silence, was slowly leaving traces everywhere. The shoji door slid without a sound. The gate no longer sagged. The garden looked more alive than it had in years. Even the boy seemed to glow a little brighter. Yet, each time she tried to thank him, Daniel would only shake his head, almost embarrassed, and retreat into his quiet corner of the house. She told herself she was imagining it. The elegance in his hands, the way he moved like a man who belonged to a world far from hers. But she wasn't. It was there, in the way he swept the Ingawa at dawn, in the careful way he avoided certain questions, in the way his eyes lingered on her just a second too long when he thought she wouldn't notice. Something about him didn't fit here. But something else, something quieter, did. What secrets hide behind the most graceful dance? In June, the quiet streets of the village began to change. Paper lanterns bloomed above the main road like soft moons. Colorful streamers fluttered in the summer breeze. Neighbors set up stalls selling yakisoba, grilled corn, and shaved ice. It was time for the Matsuri. Aya hadn't attended the festival in years. Since her grandmother passed, she preferred to spend that night inside, listening to the faint echoes of drums and laughter from her garden. But this year was different. This year, a boy with wide eyes and a worn doll tugged at her sleeve and asked, "Obasan, will there be fireworks? And a big fire?" She couldn't say no. On the afternoon of the festival, she dusted off her sewing machine and sat cross-legged on the floor, stitching a tiny yukata for Ethan from an old piece of cotton she'd kept. For Daniel, she found a slightly frayed summer shirt in the back of her closet, plain but clean. When she handed it to him, she half expected him to protest. Instead, he studied the shirt for a long second, then gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You didn't have to," he murmured. "I know, but he'll want you to match." That evening, as she knelt to adjust Ethan's yukata, smoothing the wrinkles with her palms, the boy beamed up at her and shouted, "Look, Papa, I'm handsome!" Daniel, standing at the door, stopped mid-step. For the first time since she had met him, there was something alive in his eyes, something fragile but undeniable. The festival was already alive when they arrived. The sound of taiko drums rolled through the air, mingling with laughter and the smell of sweet soy glaze. Children in yukata chased each other between the stalls. Ethan clutched her hand and ran ahead, wide-eyed, tugging her toward the cotton candy stand.
Aya paid for his treat and watched him disappear into a group of kids near the goldfish pond. When she turned back, she found Daniel standing at the edge of the crowd, watching everything and nothing all at once. His shirt fit him surprisingly well. It wasn't just the way he stood or the way his shoulders filled the fabric. It was the way he held himself, effortlessly graceful, as though he belonged to another stage entirely. Later that night, after the fireworks painted the sky in fleeting colors, the crowd began to form a circle around the bonfire for the Bon Odori dance. Aya felt herself pulled forward, though she hadn't danced in years. "Do you dance?" she asked him suddenly, half to tease him, half because she needed to know. Daniel's mouth quirked at the corner, a rare trace of mischief. "It's been a long time. If you say no, I'll insist," she said. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he extended his hand to her. The crowd made space as they stepped into the circle. The music started, slow and steady, and Aya expected him to stumble, to move awkwardly like most men from the city did. But he didn't. He moved like someone who knew exactly where his feet belonged. Each step was measured, each gesture fluid, as though his body remembered something his mind tried to forget. People noticed. Even Aya noticed. He didn't dance like a man who had wandered into this world by accident. He danced like someone who had been taught to move with elegance, by teachers who had nothing to do with quiet villages or paper lanterns. When the song ended, he let go of her hand gently, stepping back with a polite nod. Aya stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. "You're not just anyone, are you?" she whispered, though he couldn't hear her over the drums. The truth leaks out, even through closed doors. After the festival, the air in the village grew heavier, thicker. Not with summer heat this time, but with questions Aya couldn't stop asking herself. She had seen it. Everyone had seen it. The way he moved during the dance, as though the wooden boards beneath his feet belonged to him. As though grace was not learned, but inherited. And yet, each morning he woke up before dawn to sweep the Engawa. He scrubbed her kitchen floor with his sleeves rolled and his head bowed. He answered politely to the neighbors who eyed him curiously, but never offered more than a slight nod before retreating again into a silence. He was a contradiction, wrapped in quiet. And Aya couldn't stand contradictions without answers. A few nights after the Matsuri, she came home later than usual. The workshop had been busy, and her hands were sore from prying rusted bolts loose all day. She slipped off her shoes at the Genkan and noticed immediately how still the house felt. No faint laughter of Itan, no sound of dishes clinking. The air was different. Then she heard it, faint but clear, coming from the guest room at the end of the hallway. A man's voice, his voice. Not the careful Japanese he always used with her, but English, fast, sharp, weighted. She froze. The door was only slightly ajar. She knew she shouldn't listen. But something stopped her feet from moving away. No, not yet. Daniel's voice was low, clipped, but unmistakable. "I told you. I need more time." A pause. "No, I don't trust them anymore." Another silence. "The company can wait. What matters now is him." Aya's fingers curled into fists before she even realized it. Her chest tightened at the mention of company. Company? What company? Then, after another long pause, "He's fine. He's safe. But I won't let them find us yet. Not yet." Aya backed away before she could hear more, her heartbeat loud in her ears.
She slipped into the kitchen and busied herself rinsing rice, pretending nothing had happened. When he emerged minutes later, his expression was calm, as though nothing had been said, but his jaw was tighter, and his eyes flicked briefly to hers before looking away. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay on her futon, staring into the dark, hearing every creak of the old house and imagining what he might really be hiding. The next morning she caught herself watching him differently, noticing details she'd overlooked before. The way his hand lingered just slightly too long on the smooth wood of the engawa, like someone remembering a life they'd once owned. The faint imprint of a watch tan on his wrist, though he never wore a watch here. The way he flinched, just barely, when she mentioned the newspaper in passing. Later that afternoon, she found him outside, repairing the stone path that led to the garden. He glanced up when he saw her, but didn't speak. Aya watched him work for a long time, then finally asked, "You're hiding something, aren't you?" Daniel's hand stilled on the stone. He didn't answer. "Who are you, really?" she pressed. After a moment, he wiped his hands on the cloth tucked into his pocket, rose to his feet, and looked at her squarely. "Not yet," he said simply, and walked past her, leaving the question hanging between them, sharp, heavy, and alive. How much truth can you handle when the rain won't stop? That night, the rain came suddenly, a summer downpour drumming against the roof, rattling the shoji doors, and turning the garden into a mirror of black water and scattered petals. Aya stood by the window, arms folded tight against her chest, watching the raindrops race each other down the glass. She couldn't stop hearing his voice, not the soft, polite words he used with her, but the sharp English she'd heard through the cracked door. "I don't trust them anymore. The company can wait. What matters now is him." Every syllable still clung to her ribs, heavy and unwelcome. She told herself not to ask. Not tonight. Not in the middle of the rain. But her feet moved anyway. She found him outside, sitting again on the engawa, shirt clinging to his back, shoulders hunched, staring into the garden as though it could answer him. The downpour slicked his hair to his forehead, dripping down his jaw. He didn't even flinch when she slid the door open. "You'll catch cold," she said flatly. Daniel tilted his head toward her, without turning all the way. "I've had worse," he murmured. Aya stepped closer, letting the rain soak her socks where the roof's cover ended. "You're hiding something," she said, her voice lower now, almost swallowed by the storm. He said nothing, his gaze fixed on the reflection of the lantern swaying in the wet stones below. "You're not just a man who lost his way." Still nothing. "Who are you, Daniel?" Her tone cracked on his name.
Finally, he turned to face her fully. His eyes looked different in the rain, darker somehow. The faint kindness she thought she'd glimpsed days ago, replaced by something older, heavier. "Do you really want to know?" he asked quietly. Aya swallowed. "I can't decide if you're dangerous or just broken." That almost drew a smile from him, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe both," he said. The silence that followed was not peaceful. The rain filled it, loud and chaotic, but it only made the space between them feel louder. "I heard you," she admitted finally, her hands tightening at her sides. "On the phone, talking about them, about a company, about hiding." His jaw flexed, but he didn't look away. "I'm sorry you heard that," though his tone carried no apology. "You're running from something, from someone, and you've brought it here." Daniel dropped his gaze to the boards beneath his feet. "If you want us to leave, say so," he murmured. "That's not what I asked." He looked up again, the weight of him pressing into her without moving closer. "Some things
are easier if you don't know, he said finally. But harder to trust, she shot back. For the first time, he blinked, as though she'd struck a place even he hadn't expected. They stood like that for what felt like a long time. Two silhouettes carved against the storm, neither willing to step back. "You'll know when it's time," he said at last, softer now. Then he rose, the rain dripping from his hair and sleeves, and walked past her into the house, leaving her alone with the sound of water and the chill of questions she could no longer keep inside.
Sometimes the heaviest riches are invisible. The next day dawned warm and golden, but it felt wrong, like a lie written across the sky. Aya moved through the morning like a ghost, wiping counters that were already clean, folding towels that didn't need folding. Her mind replayed his words from the night before. Maybe both. You'll know when it's time. She told herself to let it go, but she couldn't. Not when every corner of the house carried his quiet presence. The repaired gate, the smoothed shoji, the boys' laughter still echoing faintly in the hall. And then came the moment she stopped pretending. Later that afternoon, she returned from the workshop early to find him in the garden. Daniel was crouched by the stone path, his hands blackened with earth, gently coaxing a stubborn weed from between the rocks. When he looked up, she was already there, arms crossed, gaze steady. "Tell me," she said simply. He wiped his hands on his trousers, sat back on his heels, and met her eyes fully this time. For the first time, she saw it. Not just exhaustion, not just guilt, but something almost like resignation. "All right," he said quietly. "You deserve that much." They sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from the untouched tea between them. Ethan slept in the guest room, the doll tucked under his chin. Daniel rested his forearms on the table, fingers loosely interlaced, and began. "My name isn't just Daniel. Daniel Crawford. My family runs one of the largest real estate and construction firms in New York."
He paused, as if waiting for her to react, but Aya simply nodded for him to continue. "When my father died, everything was handed to me. The company, the wealth, the people who smiled at me while waiting for me to fail." His fingers tightened slightly. "I thought I could handle it. I thought I was prepared." His eyes drifted toward the wall, unfocused now. "But when my wife got sick, and then gone, I realized I had no idea who I was anymore. Everyone around me was either waiting for me to fall or trying to push me." He let out a hollow laugh. "And then it wasn't about me anymore. It was about him." He nodded toward the guest room. "Ethan didn't need headlines or lawyers or boardrooms. He needed a father, and I couldn't be that man there. Not with all of them watching." Aya's hands tightened around her cup. "So you ran." "I ran. And you chose here. No one cared about my name. No one wanted anything from me. Until you." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" For a moment, his voice softened, enough that she almost didn't catch the words. "You're the only one who's looked at me like I'm just human." They sat there for a long while after that, the silence between them no longer sharp, but heavy, warm even. Aya stared at his hands, scarred in places, the faint shadow of a watch tan still clinging to his skin, hands that could build and repair, but also shield and hide. Aya spoke, her voice low in the room. "Why didn't you just tell me?" His gaze fell to the table. "Because once people know, they stop seeing me." And with that, he stood,
excusing himself to check on Ethan, leaving Aya alone at the table, her tea gone cold, her chest somehow both heavier and lighter than before.
Can you let go of someone who gave you back your own heart? The next morning, the air felt different, charged somehow. The cicadas screamed louder, and even the sunlight slanting through the shoji seemed sharper, more insistent. Aya moved through her kitchen as if the walls had shifted overnight. When she walked into the living room, she stopped. Daniel was standing by the door with a small duffel bag at his feet. The boy was still asleep, curled on the futon in the guest room, his doll clutched tight in his arms. Aya froze in the doorway. "It's time," he said simply, as though the words didn't cost him anything. But she could see it, in the way his knuckles whitened around the strap of the bag, in the faint tremor at the corner of his jaw. "Why now?" she asked, her voice calm, even as her chest felt like it might split. "Because if I stay any longer, I won't leave." He lifted the bag, but she blocked his way. "You don't have to go." "Yes," he said quietly. "I do. For him or for you? For both of us." His eyes softened, and for just a second, he looked as lost as he had the night she'd found him under the persimmon tree. "If I stay," he murmured, "I'll start to believe I deserve this. And I don't." That evening, after dinner, he slipped an envelope on the kitchen table while she was rinsing dishes. "What's this?" she asked without looking up. "It's a key and a choice." She dried her hands and opened the envelope. Inside was a small apartment key, cool and sharp in her palm. Beneath it, a folded piece of paper, an address in Tokyo written in his careful handwriting. "If you ever want to see what my world really looks like," he said, "that's where you'll find me." Aya stared down at the key. "You think I belong in your world?" Daniel's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile. "You belong wherever you choose to stand." He knelt in the guest room to wake Ethan, who rubbed his eyes and murmured sleepily, "Oba-san, why do we have to go?" Daniel scooped the boy up and held him close, whispering something Aya couldn't hear. When they reached the threshold, Daniel turned to her one last time. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything, for seeing me." Aya swallowed the lump rising in her throat, managing only a faint nod. "Take care of him," she murmured. "Always." Ethan, still half asleep in his father's arms, lifted his head and blinked at her. "I'll miss you, Oba-san." Her hands trembled as she brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'll miss you too, little one." Then they were gone. She stood in the doorway long after the sound of their footsteps had faded down the road. The envelope and key still lay on the table behind her, but she didn't reach for them yet. Not yet. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't saying goodbye. It's deciding if you want to follow. When the world comes looking for you, do you stay or follow? For days after they left, the house felt too big. Aya still woke early, out of habit, and set 3 cups on the table before catching herself. She still folded an extra futon, still swept the Engawa as though they might walk back through the gate at any moment. But the silence stayed, and so did the key. It sat on the kitchen table, cold and small, next to the envelope with the Tokyo address. A quiet challenge she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. Then the whispers began. At the market, in the workshop, even outside the temple. 2 women clutching a newspaper stopped talking when she walked past. At first she ignored them, until she heard one of them hiss, "That's her, the woman who sheltered him." That afternoon, she walked straight to the village's tiny internet cafe, dusty, dim, still reeking of instant ramen, and typed his full name into the computer. Daniel Crawford. The screen filled slowly, the connection sluggish.
But when it loaded, her breath caught. There he was, photo after photo, headlines screaming in languages she barely understood. Billionaire heir resurfaces in Tokyo after mysterious disappearance. Crawford scandal, family feud, corporate collapse, and a quiet return. The lost son of New York reclaims his place. In one photo, Daniel stood in a crisp suit, looking straight at the camera, jaw set, expression carved from stone. And next to him, holding that same tattered doll, was Ethan, smiling faintly, as though nothing had changed. Aya closed the browser, her hands trembling. The room suddenly felt too small, too loud, full hum of old computers and gossiping villagers outside. That night, she opened the little wooden box her grandmother used to keep her letters in. Inside lay the key, the envelope, and a note she hadn't noticed before, folded between the papers, written in his handwriting. "Aya," it began simply, "if you're reading this, it means the world has found me before I could explain everything. But nothing about what happened between us was a lie. You gave me something no one else could, the chance to feel human again. Ethan still asks about you, and so do I. If you ever want to know the rest, you know where to find me." Her chest tightened. She folded the note carefully and placed it back in the box. Then she set it aside and stared at the key for a long time. The next morning, she walked into the workshop and hung her apron neatly on the wall. The old mechanic raised his eyebrows. "Bad news?" he asked. She shook her head faintly. "Just a different kind of news." 2 days later, she boarded a bus to Tokyo, the little box resting in her lap. She kept her eyes on the mountains as they receded behind her, replaced by highways, then skyscrapers, then the restless gray sprawl of the city. When she stepped off the bus, she felt dizzy but steady. She held the key tightly in her fist, like a secret no one could take from her. Later that afternoon, in a quiet park, she saw him. Not right away. Not until she heard the familiar laugh of a child echo through the trees. Ethan was running through the grass, still clutching his doll, while Daniel stood a few steps behind, watching him with that same quiet intensity. She stopped in the shadow of a cherry tree, her heart hammering, and waited, until Ethan looked up, spotted her, and shouted, "Oba-san!"
Some journeys end where another begins. For a moment, time held its breath. Aya stayed frozen under the cherry tree, her fingers still curled around the key in her pocket as Ethan's small feet thundered toward her. "Oba-san!" He crashed into her legs, wrapping his little arms around her knees. She dropped to her heels, brushing his messy hair back from his forehead. "You came," he whispered, almost like a secret. "I told you I'd miss you," she replied softly. When she finally looked up, Daniel was standing a few steps away, as still as stone. His hands were shoved into his pockets, his tie loosened, his hair longer now. But his eyes, when they met hers, were full of something raw, something that looked like relief and fear all tangled together. For a second, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, he took a step closer. "I wasn't sure," he began, his voice low, "if you'd come." "Neither was I," she admitted. They stood in silence, the sounds of children playing and birds wrestling filling the spaces between them. Finally, he extended his hand toward her, open, steady, waiting. "We can take it slow," he said simply. Aya hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. And just like that, the weight she'd carried alone for so long seemed to shift. Not vanish, but become something she didn't have to carry alone anymore. In the weeks that followed, she didn't return to the village. Instead, she began learning how to move through the city, its rush and noise, its bright lights and hidden corners. At first, she kept her distance, renting her own small room, finding quiet cafes to sit in when it all became too much. But little by little, she found herself gravitating back toward them. Some evenings, she would join Daniel and Ethan at their apartment, helping Ethan with his schoolwork, cooking simple meals in the quiet kitchen. Other nights, they all sat together on the floor, playing cards or listening to the hum of the city beyond the windows. Daniel never pushed, but his eyes always said more than his words dared to.
One Sunday, he took her to the edge of the city, to an old, abandoned train station, surrounded by weeds and memories. "Why here?" she asked, watching Ethan chase a butterfly along the rusted tracks. "This was my wife's favorite place," he said quietly. "She used to say, 'The tracks remind you that life keeps moving, even when you feel stuck.'" Aya glanced at him, her chest tightening. "And what do they remind you of?" Daniel's gaze stayed on the horizon, "that I can't keep running forever." He reached into his pocket and handed her a folded piece of paper, a rough sketch of a building, a community center, its walls open and full of light. "I want to build this for people like us, people who don't quite fit, who carry too much and belong nowhere." Her fingers brushed the edges of the drawing. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely above the wind. Daniel finally looked at her, his eyes steady. "Because you taught me what it means to come home." Months later, the center opened, the Station of Hope. Children ran through its halls. Single mothers gathered to share meals, and at its heart, Aya, Daniel, and Ethan stood side by side, greeting the first visitors as though the three of them had been waiting their whole lives for this moment. That night, under the soft glow of lanterns in the garden, Daniel found her by the flowers, Ethan asleep on her lap. "When I first came to your door," he murmured, "I was just a man running away. Now, I'm a man who wants to stay." Aya didn't answer right away. She simply reached out, slipped her hand into his, and gave it the faintest squeeze. Because some stories don't need grand declarations. They just need someone to open the door. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that kindness can change everything, and that even the loneliest doors can open to something beautiful, don't forget to like this video. Subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories of people who find themselves caught between two worlds. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share it with them. You never know whose life it might touch.